What if you came home after being missing for 4 years, only to find your ranch in better condition than the day you left? Caleb Dawson expected abandoned fields, empty barns, and foreclosure notices. Instead, he found healthy cattle, repaired fences, warm lights in the farmhouse, and a quiet widow who claimed she had been waiting for him all along. She wasn't family. She wasn't hired help. And the reason she gave for saving his ranch would uncover a single act of kindness Caleb had long forgotten, but one that had quietly changed someone's life forever. Late autumn settled quietly over Montana's Bitterroot Valley. Beneath a pale gray sky, cold winds carried the scent of damp earth, fallen maple leaves, and the mist rising from the Bitterroot River after days of gentle mountain rain. Caleb Dawson had forgotten what silence sounded like before the mountains taught it to him. At 46 years old, he carried the weathered face of a man who had survived far more than anyone should. Standing just over 6 feet 2 inches tall, Caleb possessed the broad shoulders and powerful frame built through decades of cattle ranching rather than gymnasium exercise. His dark brown hair, once neatly trimmed, had grown uneven during the years he disappeared, now streaked heavily with silver that had arrived far too early. A thick beard, roughly cut with a hunting knife somewhere deep in the wilderness, framed his square jaw and emphasized the sharp lines carved into his face by hardship. His steel-blue eyes remained remarkably clear, though they carried the permanent caution of someone who had spent years watching every shadow for danger. His hands were massive, calloused, and crossed by countless thin scars left by barbed wire, axes, frozen rock, and survival. Friends had always described Caleb as a quiet man who spoke only after thinking carefully. He never sought recognition for helping others. If a neighbor's fence collapsed during a storm, Caleb appeared before sunrise carrying tools. If someone lost cattle during winter, he quietly joined the search without expecting thanks. His late father often reminded him that the strongest ranchers were measured by the burdens they carried for others, not by the size of their herds. Caleb had never forgotten those words. For years earlier, he had left Bitterroot Ranch to survey an old mountain trail, crossing the Sapphire Mountains before winter closed the passes. He traveled alone except for his trusted gelding, Dusty, believing he would return within 3 days. Instead, an unexpected avalanche buried the narrow trail beneath thousands of tons of snow and rock. The horse escaped. Caleb did not. When rescuers searched the mountains, they found broken equipment, scattered supplies, and signs of the avalanche's immense force. No body was ever recovered. After several weeks, the search ended. The sheriff signed the official report. The town mourned. Bitterroot Valley slowly accepted what nobody wanted to believe. Caleb Dawson was presumed dead, but the mountains had chosen a different ending. He survived with broken ribs, a shattered ankle, and little more than instinct. Winter trapped him high above civilization. He learned to build shelters beneath fallen timber, catch trout from icy streams, and follow the movements of elk to avoid starving. More than once fever nearly claimed him after infected wounds spread through his body. Loneliness proved even more dangerous than hunger. Entire seasons passed without hearing another human voice. Time itself lost meaning. Only when a group of backcountry hunters stumbled upon his remote shelter during the fourth autumn did his impossible journey back to civilization finally begin. Now, wrapped inside an old canvas coat donated by the hunters, Caleb slowly guided Dusty along the familiar dirt road leading toward home. Dusty had grown old. The once powerful bay gelding now carried gray around his muzzle, and every step revealed the stiffness of age. Yet the horse recognized the road before Caleb did. His ears lifted. His pace quickened despite exhaustion. Caleb's heartbeat became heavier with every mile. He had imagined this moment hundreds of times beside lonely campfires. Sometimes the ranch stood abandoned. Sometimes burned. Sometimes owned by strangers. Most often he imagined foreclosure notices nailed to empty barn doors while weeds swallowed every pasture his family had worked for generations to build. He blamed no one. For years was longer than hope could reasonably survive. As Bitterroot Ranch finally appeared beyond a stand of cottonwood trees, Caleb slowly pulled Dusty to a stop. Nothing matched the picture he had carried inside his mind. Thin white smoke drifted steadily from the farmhouse chimney. Fresh fence posts stretched across the eastern pasture. The old windmill turned smoothly beneath the autumn wind instead of standing rusted and broken. Nearly 200 healthy black Angus cattle grazed peacefully across fields that looked better maintained than when he had left them. Someone had repaired the weathered red barn. Someone had painted the gates. Someone had cared. Caleb stared without speaking. For several long moments, he wondered if exhaustion had finally begun stealing his mind. Then the farmhouse door opened. A woman stepped quietly onto the front porch. She appeared to be in her early 40s, standing about 5 feet 7 inches tall with a slender but resilient build shaped by years of honest physical work. Her chestnut hair, touched with a few strands of early silver, was tied loosely behind her neck beneath a faded wool scarf. Soft green eyes rested calmly upon Caleb without surprise or fear. Her fair skin carried the gentle weathering of long days spent beneath Montana's changing skies, while her hands bore the roughness of repairing fences, carrying feed buckets, and working beside livestock. She wore a simple brown canvas coat over a blue flannel dress and worn leather boots dusted with hay. There was quiet strength in everything about her. Grief had visited her life before, leaving behind patience instead of bitterness. She neither rushed toward him nor hesitated. Instead, she smiled gently. "I was beginning to wonder if the mountains planned on keeping you forever." Caleb remained frozen in the saddle. His voice came out little more than a whisper. "Who are you?" "My name is Abigail Turner." She stepped slowly down the porch stairs. "I've been waiting for you." The words unsettled him more than anything he had experienced during 4 years alone in the wilderness. Waiting? How could anyone still be waiting? Confusion filled every thought as he dismounted stiffly from Dusty. Abigail quietly took the horse's reins with practiced hands. "He deserves fresh oats before any questions." Caleb noticed how naturally Dusty followed her toward the barn, as though he already knew her. Inside, the farmhouse warmth wrapped around him like something almost forgotten. Fresh bread cooled beside the stove. Beef stew simmered slowly in an old cast-iron pot. The scent alone nearly overwhelmed him. He realized he could not remember the last meal someone else had prepared. Neither spoke much while he ate. Abigail seemed to understand that some hungers reached deeper than conversation. Only after Caleb finished his second bowl did she carefully place an old envelope upon the kitchen table. "You helped my family once." Caleb frowned. "I don't remember." "I know." Her voice remained gentle. "That's why I never forgot." She explained that 6 years earlier her husband, Daniel Turner, had died when a logging crane failed during a timber operation outside Hamilton. Daniel had left behind heavy medical bills, equipment loans, and one final bank payment the family could never afford. Abigail had prepared herself to lose everything. Then, without warning, someone quietly paid the remaining debt. No letter, no signature, no request for repayment. She spent weeks trying to discover who had done it. Eventually, the bank manager privately told her one name: Caleb Dawson. "He asked you never to tell me," Caleb said softly as fragments of memory returned. Abigail nodded. "You left before I could even say thank you." When news spread 4 years later that Caleb had disappeared in the mountains and Bitterroot Ranch faced foreclosure, Abigail remembered the man who had saved her family without asking anything in return. So she sold her own small property, moved into the ranch, paid the overdue mortgage, raised the calves, repaired broken fences, balanced every account, protected everything she believed belonged to the man who had once protected her. Without another word, she reached beneath the table and lifted a thick leather ledger. Its pages had swollen from years of constant use. She opened it carefully. Every expense, every repaired fence, every calf born, every veterinary visit, every feed purchase, every dollar earned, everything recorded with remarkable precision across more than 3 years. Caleb slowly turned the pages, unable to speak. Near the final entry, Abigail had written one sentence: "I never came here to repay the money. I came to protect the kindness that saved my family." Caleb closed the ledger. For the first time since walking out of the mountains, tears quietly filled his eyes. The news spread across Bitterroot Valley faster than the first snow rolling down the Sapphire Mountains. Before another sunset arrived, every ranch, feed store, church, and cafe knew the impossible truth. Caleb Dawson, the rancher everyone had mourned for years earlier, had come home alive. For the first several weeks, Caleb's greatest battle was no longer survival. It was learning how to live among people again. Years alone in the wilderness had changed him in ways few could understand. Sudden noises still made him instinctively reach for tools that were no longer weapons. He often woke before dawn expecting freezing mountain winds instead of the comforting crackle of the farmhouse stove. Even simple conversations exhausted him. Abigail never questioned those moments. She simply allowed silence to exist whenever words became too heavy. Each morning they worked together. Caleb slowly regained strength repairing corrals, replacing fence rails, and checking cattle across the rolling pastures. Although his body remained leaner than before the avalanche, the familiar rhythm of ranch life gradually rebuilt muscles weakened by years of hardship. Sometimes he caught Abigail completing difficult tasks before sunrise simply because she assumed he still needed more rest. He quietly noticed. One cold December morning they rode horseback together toward the northern pasture. The cattle looked healthy. Their winter coats had thickened. Feed storage remained well organized. Caleb studied everything carefully. "I don't understand," he finally admitted. "You should have lost half the herd." Abigail smiled faintly. "I almost did." She pointed toward a distant meadow. "The first winter after you disappeared was brutal. We had 3 blizzards before Christmas." As they rode, she quietly described the years Caleb had never witnessed. The second month after moving onto the ranch, pneumonia spread through part of the herd. With almost no money left after paying overdue mortgage installments, Abigail spent countless nights sleeping inside the calving barn beside sick animals, feeding medicine one calf at a time. The following spring, melting snow from the Sapphire Mountains flooded Bitterroot River far beyond its normal banks. Water destroyed nearly half the eastern fencing. She rebuilt it herself. Summer brought drought. Winter returned with record snowfall. Every season seemed determined to test whether she would finally surrender. She never did. Not because she believed she was extraordinary. Because every morning she remembered one simple truth. Someone had once saved her family when no one else would. Now it was her turn. Caleb listened quietly. No mountain he had survived felt heavier than the gratitude growing inside him. Several days later, while searching for replacement hinges inside his late father's storage shed, Caleb noticed an old cedar chest tucked beneath a faded canvas tarp. Dust covered every surface. The brass lock had nearly rusted shut. He carried it onto the workbench and slowly lifted the lid. Inside rested hundreds of neatly bundled envelopes tied together with worn leather straps. Every bundle carried a handwritten year. Curious, Caleb opened the oldest letter. A trembling handwritten message thanked his grandfather for donating fencing materials after a wildfire destroyed a neighboring ranch. Another thanked his father for lending breeding bulls without charging a struggling family. A third came from a young couple whose first hay harvest had been saved because the Dawson family repaired their broken baler free of charge. Letter after letter revealed stories Caleb had never heard. Some families had received interest-free loans. Others received cattle feed, medical bills, emergency equipment, anonymous groceries delivered during difficult winters. His family had helped quietly, almost secretly, without asking anyone to remember. Beneath the final stack rested a folded piece of paper written in his father's familiar handwriting. Attached to the inside of the cedar lid was a small carved wooden plaque. Its message had darkened with age. "Kindness is the only debt that grows richer when returned." Caleb traced the carved letters with his fingertips. For a long time, neither he nor Abigail spoke. Finally, he looked toward her. "My father kept every thank you letter." Abigail nodded softly. He wasn't collecting gratitude. He was collecting reminders. Of what? That helping people is never wasted. That evening, Caleb carried the cedar chest into the farmhouse. He read late into the night. Many names belonged to people still living somewhere across Bitterroot Valley. Others had long since passed away. Yet every letter carried the same pattern. One act of kindness had quietly changed another family's future. The following Sunday, Caleb surprised Abigail during breakfast. "I've made a decision." She looked up from her coffee. "What kind of decision?" "We're opening the ranch." She frowned slightly. "For visitors?" "For neighbors who need help." He explained his idea carefully. Every Saturday and Sunday, Bitterroot Ranch would become a place where struggling ranchers could borrow tools, repair broken equipment, receive practical advice, or simply ask for an extra pair of hands. No payment, no contracts, no publicity, only help. Abigail smiled. "Your father would have liked that." The first weekend, almost nobody came. The second brought one elderly rancher needing help repairing a broken cattle trailer. The third weekend, two young brothers arrived carrying damaged fencing equipment. Word slowly spread. Not everyone approved. Several neighbors gathered outside Miller's feed supply discussing Caleb's newest idea. Most shook their heads. One man insisted no business survived by giving work away. Another predicted people would simply take advantage of his generosity. An older rancher laughed. Caleb spent 4 years surviving in the mountains. Looks like he came back even more stubborn. Caleb heard the criticism. He answered none of it. Instead, the next Saturday morning, he and Abigail stood together beside the open workshop doors waiting for whoever might arrive. As the autumn sun climbed above the Bitterroot Mountains, an old pickup slowly rolled into the yard. Then another, and another. By noon, more people were waiting outside the workshop than either of them had expected. Spring arrived with unusual violence across Bitterroot Valley. Days of relentless rain swelled the Bitterroot River until its quiet waters became a roaring torrent, carrying uprooted trees, shattered fences, and entire sections of riverbank downstream beneath dark, storm-filled skies. Caleb had witnessed harsh Montana springs before. None resembled this. For nearly a week, rain pounded the valley without mercy. Snowmelt from the Sapphire Mountains poured into every creek and tributary until rivers burst beyond their banks. On the 7th morning, Caleb and Abigail rode toward the southern boundary to inspect flood damage. The road disappeared beneath muddy water. Half the eastern pasture stood underwater. Several hundred Black Angus cattle gathered nervously on the highest ground they could find, unable to reach the western grazing fields where fresh hay remained stored. Then Caleb saw the bridge. The old wooden bridge connecting Bitterroot Ranch to the county highway had vanished. Only twisted support beams remained above the rushing water. His heart sank. Without that crossing, feed trucks, veterinarians, fuel deliveries, and livestock transport could no longer reach the ranch. If the floodwaters remained for weeks, the cattle would eventually exhaust every available hay reserve. Abigail stood beside him in silence. "We've survived worse," she said softly. Caleb wanted to believe her, but numbers rarely lied. That evening they carefully counted every hay bale remaining inside the barns. Enough for perhaps 12 days. Maybe 14 if every ration was reduced. No more. The next morning Caleb drove as far as washed-out roads allowed before walking several miles through mud to the county emergency office. Every bridge crew had already been assigned elsewhere. Entire communities needed rescue. Repairs could take weeks. He thanked the officials without complaint. As he walked back toward the ranch beneath steady rain, he accepted a truth he had learned long ago. Sometimes nature offered no shortcuts. The following sunrise brought an unexpected sound. Engines. Not one. Dozens. Caleb stepped outside expecting emergency vehicles. Instead, he saw pickup trucks, old ranch trucks, flatbed trailers, horse trailers, farm tractors. They stretched almost beyond sight along the muddy county road. Men climbed out carrying chainsaws. Women unloaded food supplies. Teenagers shouldered fence posts. Children carried boxes filled with work gloves. Nobody waited for instructions. Nobody asked permission. An elderly rancher stepped forward first. Caleb immediately recognized him. Harold Jensen, now nearly 75 years old, stood tall despite his age. His white beard rested against a faded denim jacket, while deep wrinkles surrounded kind blue eyes shaped by decades beneath Montana skies. Years earlier, Harold's family had nearly lost everything after a devastating wildfire destroyed their winter hay supply. Caleb's father had quietly delivered dozens of hay bales before sunrise. Harold had never forgotten. He removed his old hat. "Your father once saved my ranch." He pointed toward the growing crowd. "I think today, we're returning the favor." Before Caleb could answer, another truck arrived. Then another. Soon hundreds of volunteers filled the valley. Some had been helped personally by the Dawson family. Others were sons, daughters, and grandchildren of people whose lives had once been changed by an anonymous act of kindness. One middle-aged woman carried an old letter. "My mother kept this until the day she died." Inside was one of the thank you notes Caleb had discovered inside the cedar chest. "My parents survived because your grandfather loaned them cattle after the blizzard of 1983. Nearby, two brothers unloaded lumber. Our father told us if the Dawson family ever needed help, we were supposed to come. No one organized them. No government agency coordinated the work. People simply arrived. Some rebuilt fences. Others repaired damaged corrals. Volunteer veterinarians vaccinated stressed cattle. Local mechanics repaired tractors flooded by muddy water. Helicopter owners from neighboring counties transported hay to isolated pastures unreachable by road. Church groups prepared thousands of hot meals. High school students stacked sandbags beside vulnerable barns. By sunset, Bitterroot Ranch looked less like a disaster zone and more like the center of an entire community working with one shared purpose. Abigail quietly watched from the porch. Tears filled her eyes. "This isn't charity anymore," she whispered. Caleb nodded slowly. "No, it never was." 3 days later, the temporary bridge stood complete. It wasn't beautiful, but it held. The first feed truck crossed safely before sunrise while hundreds of volunteers cheered from both riverbanks. Word spread far beyond Montana. Television crews arrived. Newspapers published photographs showing neighbors rebuilding an entire ranch together without contracts, wages, or political campaigns. Journalists kept asking the same question: who organized this? Nobody could answer, because no one had. Several weeks later, another visitor arrived at Bitterroot Ranch. Professor Benjamin Harper stepped from a university vehicle, carrying nothing except notebooks and a weatherproof camera case. 58 years old, Benjamin possessed a tall, slender build, neatly combed silver-brown hair, thoughtful hazel eyes behind rectangular glasses, and the quiet curiosity of a lifelong historian. A professor of community history at the University of Montana, he had spent 3 decades studying how acts of generosity shaped rural American towns across generations. Patient, observant, and deeply respectful, Benjamin believed history lived most clearly through ordinary people rather than famous names. For nearly a week, he interviewed volunteers. He read old letters from the cedar chest. He mapped family connections stretching back more than 50 years. Finally, he closed his notebook. "I've never seen anything quite like this." Caleb smiled modestly. "We just helped each other." Benjamin gently shook his head. "No. What happened here is much larger." He drew a circle inside his notebook. One family helps another. That family helps someone else. Years later, kindness returns without anyone expecting it. He looked toward the hundreds of repaired fences stretching across the valley. "I'm going to call this the living circle of kindness." The phrase appeared in his published research only months later. Soon national television networks featured Bitterroot Ranch. Documentary filmmakers arrived. Newspapers from across America printed photographs of volunteers standing shoulder to shoulder across the rebuilt bridge. Yet whenever reporters asked Caleb how he created such extraordinary loyalty, he always gave exactly the same answer. "We didn't create it. My father simply planted seeds that other people never stopped growing." For years passed quietly across Bitterroot Valley. Each autumn painted the Montana hills in gold and crimson, while cold winds carried the scent of pine, hay, and would smoke through a ranch that had become known less for its cattle than for the people whose lives it quietly restored. Bitterroot Ranch no longer awakened only to the sounds of livestock. Every Monday morning, pickup trucks rolled through the front gate, carrying veterans searching for a new beginning. Wednesday afternoons welcomed widows who had inherited ranches they had never expected to manage alone. Weekends filled with young men and women who had lost factory jobs, family farms, or simply confidence in themselves. Some stayed for a few days. Others remained for months. None paid a single dollar. Caleb insisted that everyone contributed according to their ability rather than their wallet. Some repaired fences. Others cooked meals. Some cared for horses. Others learned machinery repair. Everyone belonged somewhere. Abigail Turner quietly became the heart of everything. At 46 years old, she carried herself with the same calm strength Caleb had first noticed years before. Her chestnut hair now showed more silver than before, yet it only seemed to deepen the quiet dignity she carried. Her warm green eyes missed almost nothing. She remembered every visitor's name, every birthday, every family member waiting back home, and every hidden worry someone tried to conceal behind a smile. Years of managing Bitterroot Ranch had made her both practical and compassionate. She balanced budgets in the early morning, organized volunteers before breakfast, comforted frightened newcomers during lunch, and somehow still found time to bake fresh bread for everyone before evening. People often said Abigail never raised her voice because she never needed to. Her kindness created the kind of respect that authority rarely could. Caleb often joked that he managed cattle. Abigail managed hope. One chilly October morning, a young veteran named Lucas Bennett arrived carrying everything he owned inside 2 weathered duffel bags. 31 years old, Lucas stood 6 feet tall with an athletic build that years of military service had not erased despite recent hardship. His short black hair had begun growing uneven after months without steady work, while tired hazel eyes reflected sleepless nights rather than physical exhaustion. A faint scar crossed his left eyebrow, a reminder of an overseas deployment he rarely discussed. Though naturally disciplined and hardworking, Lucas had struggled to adjust after leaving the Army. Failed job interviews and mounting debt slowly convinced him that civilian life had no place for him. He spoke little, avoided eye contact, and apologized even when unnecessary, carrying invisible burdens heavier than any backpack. Caleb never asked about the scar. Instead, he handed Lucas a pair of work gloves. The north fence needs another set of hands. Nothing more. Nothing less. Weeks became months. Lucas learned livestock care, welding, equipment maintenance, and pasture management. More importantly, he laughed again. Nearby worked a young widow named Emily Ross, whose family ranch had nearly failed after her husband died in a tractor accident. Abigail patiently taught her bookkeeping, livestock records, and business planning. Soon Emily returned home with enough knowledge to save her own operation. Stories like theirs quietly multiplied. Former students began calling each other whenever trouble appeared. One ranch loaned tractors after breakdowns. Another delivered hay during drought. Families exchanged breeding bulls instead of purchasing expensive replacements. Mechanics traveled across county lines without charging labor. Retired ranchers volunteered as mentors. No organization demanded membership. No contracts existed. Only trust. Professor Benjamin Harper returned every spring to continue documenting what had become far larger than anyone first imagined. His research now stretched beyond Montana. Small ranches across Idaho and Wyoming had begun copying the same principles after reading newspaper articles and watching television documentaries about Bitterroot Ranch. Benjamin carefully mapped the growing relationships. By the 4th year, he counted more than 300 independent family ranches voluntarily participating. Equipment was shared. Feed was shared. Knowledge was shared. Most importantly, no family faced disaster alone. During one gathering beneath the old cottonwood trees, Benjamin unfolded a large map across a picnic table. Colored lines connected ranches throughout 3 states. Looking at the network, Caleb remained speechless. Benjamin smiled. It has outgrown the ranch. Abigail studied the map quietly. What should we call it? Benjamin considered the question before answering. Community Ranch Network. The name spread naturally. No marketing campaign introduced it. Ranchers simply began using the words themselves. Within another year, agricultural organizations invited Caleb and Abigail to speak at regional conferences. They accepted only a few invitations. Neither enjoyed public attention. Whenever reporters praised Caleb for creating an extraordinary movement, he gently corrected them. I didn't build this. My father planted it. My grandfather watered it. We're simply taking care of it. The greatest reward arrived without cameras. One snowy December evening, Caleb walked through the old workshop after everyone had gone home. Inside the cedar chest where generations of thank you letters had rested, he noticed something new. Fresh envelopes. Dozens of them. Each came from families who had graduated from Bitterroot Ranch. One thanked Lucas for rebuilding a widow's barn. Another thanked Emily for teaching bookkeeping to struggling ranchers. A third described volunteers saving cattle during another harsh winter. Caleb quietly smiled. The chest his father had filled for decades had begun filling itself again. Without anyone asking. Without anyone keeping score. Outside, laughter echoed from the farmhouse where new students shared dinner beside longtime volunteers. For the first time since returning from the mountains, Caleb fully understood something his father had always known. Kindness was never meant to stop with the person who received it. It was meant to keep traveling. And as another Montana winter settled gently across Bitterroot Valley, the circle quietly continued growing. 8 years later, autumn returned once again to Montana's Bitterroot Valley. Beneath soft gray skies, golden cottonwood leaves drifted across quiet pastures, while the Bitterroot River flowed gently between ranches that had learned long ago that their greatest strength no longer came from standing alone. Time had transformed Bitterroot Ranch into something no one could have imagined. The cattle were still there. The horses still wandered peacefully beneath wide Montana skies. But visitors no longer traveled hundreds of miles simply to study livestock or grazing techniques. They came to understand something far more difficult to measure: hope. Every month buses arrived carrying university students, agricultural researchers, military veterans, church groups, and young farming families from across America. Professors discussed sustainable rural communities beneath the same barn where volunteers once stacked emergency hay during the flood. Agricultural organizations held workshops inside buildings that had nearly collapsed years before. What had once been a struggling family ranch had quietly become a living classroom where compassion was treated with the same importance as economics. Abigail Turner welcomed every visitor with the same quiet warmth she had shown Caleb the day he returned home. Now in her early 50s, her gentle smile had changed very little despite the passing years. More silver threaded through her chestnut hair, and the lines around her green eyes reflected countless moments of laughter, sorrow, gratitude, and perseverance. Young volunteers often called her Miss Abigail, though she insisted everyone simply use her first name. She still believed people learned best when they first felt accepted. Caleb remained much the same. His beard had turned almost completely silver, yet his broad shoulders still carried hay bales beside volunteers half his age. He refused to stand behind podiums longer than necessary and preferred teaching beside broken fences rather than inside conference halls. Whenever students asked complicated questions about leadership, Caleb usually handed them a hammer before offering an answer. One October afternoon, a national documentary crew arrived to film the ranch's story. The producer assigned to the project introduced herself as Rebecca Collins. 44 years old, Rebecca possessed shoulder-length dark auburn hair, thoughtful gray eyes, and an energetic confidence earned through years of traveling across rural America documenting remarkable human stories. Unlike many reporters, she listened far longer than she spoke. Growing up on a struggling family farm in Nebraska had taught her that the most meaningful stories rarely belonged to famous people. They belonged to ordinary neighbors whose quiet choices changed lives. For 3 days, Rebecca interviewed ranch families, former students, volunteers, professors, and local children. Again and again she heard nearly identical words. Someone helped us, so now we help someone else. When her final interview began, she and Caleb sat together beneath the old cottonwood tree overlooking the western pasture where cattle grazed peacefully beneath the setting sun. Rebecca noticed something hanging inside the nearby farmhouse. An old wooden sign. Its edges had weathered with age, yet every carved letter remained clear. Caleb smiled before she even asked. "My father made that." The camera slowly focused on the inscription. "The strongest fences are never built with wood. They are built with kindness." Silence settled for a moment. Rebecca lowered her notebook. "After everything you've survived," she asked gently, "what's the most valuable thing you found when you finally came home?" Caleb looked across the valley. He watched Lucas Bennett teaching another young veteran how to repair a gate. He saw Emily Ross laughing with several widows while organizing donated equipment. Nearby, children whose parents had once been strangers chased each other through fields where despair had once lived. Finally, he answered, "I thought I was coming home to save my ranch." He paused. A quiet smile appeared. "But I came home to discover that kindness had been protecting it all along." Rebecca never asked another question. She didn't need to. Months later, the documentary aired nationwide. Universities added Bitterroot Ranch to courses discussing rural leadership, agricultural resilience, and community cooperation. Farming organizations invited Caleb and Abigail to receive awards, though they accepted only a few. Recognition had never been their goal. One snowy evening after another successful training season ended, Caleb unlocked the old cedar chest one last time before closing the workshop for winter. The original thank you letters from his grandfather and father still rested safely inside. But now they shared the space with hundreds of newer letters. Letters written by veterans who had rebuilt their lives, by widows who had saved family ranches, by children who hoped to continue farming because someone had believed in their parents. Caleb carefully placed the newest envelope on top. It came from a young family in Wyoming whose ranch had survived drought because strangers from the community ranch network delivered hay without asking for payment. He quietly closed the lid. The chest was finally full. Not with paper, with proof. Outside, snow began falling gently across Bitterroot Valley. Caleb and Abigail stood together on the farmhouse porch watching volunteers drive home beneath glowing headlights stretching across the valley roads. Neither spoke. Some moments needed no words. Years later, visitors still asked local people where Bitterroot Ranch was located. Older residents smiled before giving directions. Yet something curious had happened. Almost nobody remembered that the ranch had once stood on the edge of foreclosure. Few remembered the flood. Even fewer remembered the years Caleb disappeared into the mountains. Instead, they remembered a ranch where strangers became neighbors, where gratitude quietly crossed generations, where one anonymous act of kindness returned years later to rescue the very man who had first given it away. And throughout Montana, parents began telling their children a simple truth whenever they passed through Bitterroot Valley. Kindness never disappears. Sometimes, it simply takes the long way home. Sometimes, God's greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder or signs in the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, through ordinary people who choose kindness when no one is watching. Caleb believed he had survived the mountains by strength alone. But when he finally came home, he discovered that God had been protecting his life in another way all along. Through the compassion he had once shown a stranger, a kindness that returned years later when he needed it most. Perhaps that is how God often works. He plants small seeds of love in our hearts and allows them to grow long after we have forgotten where we planted them. Every day, people around us are carrying burdens we cannot see. A neighbor may be struggling to keep a family together. A veteran may be fighting battles that ended years ago but still live inside his heart. A widow may simply need someone to believe she is not alone. We may never know how one small act of generosity, one encouraging word, or one helping hand could change another person's future. But God knows. And sometimes, years later, those same acts of kindness find their way back to us in ways we never imagined. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who could use a reminder that kindness is never wasted. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, or share a time when someone showed you unexpected kindness. And if you believe stories of faith, hope, and compassion still matter, please subscribe to the channel and join our growing family. May God bless you, your loved ones, and your home. May He give you strength in difficult seasons, peace in uncertain days, and a heart that never grows tired of doing good. And may the kindness you give today become tomorrow's miracle for someone else. God bless you all.